And when the rest of them get here, they can catch up.
Okay.
Lord, we're thankful again today for your goodness, your hand of protection you keep on us, your blessings that you pour out on us. Lord, I pray tonight as we open your word that you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things you'd have me to say, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're going to start with 1 Samuel chapter 8. And if I can read out of these things. We're going to pick up the story where we left off last week. You remember Samuel had been chosen to be the judge, priest, and prophet to Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the extent of what we know about that period of time up until today. We don't know a whole lot of what went on. So let's start 1 Samuel chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. Now it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside from dishonest gain, dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said it, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. All right. Now the exact age of Samuel at this time is not known. He had to have been at least 40, but probably he was someplace in his 60s approximately at this time. We don't know how long his two sons judged. Evidently it was long enough for them to have been corrupted, Yeah. So when you first appoint them, usually judges are going to behave themselves, so it takes a while. So my guess, and nobody knows, but my guess would be he was someplace up in his 60s, maybe even 70s at this time. Now he appointed his two sons. Now these were to be civil judges. These were not judges like he was. He was somebody who judged very important matters after seeking God. These were civil judges. So if you had a problem with your neighbor, you'd go to one of his two sons and get it judged there. Now there was probably a lot of judges at this time, by the way, that were on the same level as Joel and Abijah. Hi, come on in.
Hello.
So these two were not spiritual judges. They were probably not unique. They were just judges, like we would have today. Now they were in Beersheba, which was the southernmost part of Israeli territory at that time. So what they did was they had the southern part, and you remember from last week where Samuel made his circuit, he had the central and northern part, and so his two sons had this southern area. Now there were probably somebody at the north and somebody on the east side that were also appointed to be civil judges. Now unlike his father, these two were dishonest, and they took bribes, and they did things they shouldn't do. They perverted the judgments, the civil judgments. Now, it's important, I think, and I think the reason it's important that this is pointed out isn't because the magnitude of their transgressions. They were clear down in Beersheba, and it says here that all the elders of Israel, they all came together, all the elders of Israel. So that means everybody on the east side of the Jordan, Manasseh, half the tribe of Manasseh and Gad, and Dan, and all of Ephraim, they were all up in the north and central areas. Why did they care what these two guys were doing in the south. So I think what it points out is that these guys, while they perverted justice, and they were evil men as far as their duties as judges, that was not the real reason the elders came to Samuel. All the elders got together, and they came to Samuel, and what they said was, hey, they wanted Samuel to make us a king like everybody else has. We want to be like else. We want to be the same. They have a king, we want a king. And this was an opportunity for them to come to Samuel and say, look, you got these two perverted kids out here judging. So, because of that, we want a king. Any kind of an excuse to try to make themselves like everybody else. But the whole intent of God was that they not be like everybody else. That was the whole purpose. When he brought them out of Egypt, he said, I want you to be a separate people. He said, I will be your God. In other words, I will be your leader. I will be the one who controls what goes on in your nation. I will be the one who fights your battles. I will be the one, whatever. So, they came to Samuel, and of course they also used the excuse, Samuel, you're getting old. And underlying reasoning for making that statement was that if Samuel were to die or something, his two sons would be the next in line to be prophet priests, and they didn't want these two guys doing that. Now, whether that's true or not, that's just an assumption, we kind of have to make there. And so they demanded to have a king. But the thing displeased Samuel. And what that means by displeased is, he became offended. He had been ruling Israel as judge, prophet, and priest in that capacity for all these years. And they never had a battle. They didn't have to go to war. I mean, everybody just stayed back because they understood the power of Samuel. And so the enemy didn't come in. And everything was all peaceful, except for his two sons causing problems. But it was all, pretty peaceful. But in the face of that, they chose to have a king rather than to have Samuel. And so his offense was, hey, I've done a good job, now they want to throw me out and go get a king. That would be what we would look at in today's vernacular. So Samuel prayed. Thing is here I like about this is Samuel was not afraid to go to God in prayer. Now people today, they get offended, and what do? They go pray, right? Yeah, right. They get on the phone. They get on their cell phone. You know what these dirty, rotten people are doing. You know what and they start in, and they're yapping, and they're carrying on. You see it all the time. I see it, and then the rumors start, and it's that kind of a thing. But Samuel did what he should have done, and that's go to God and say, hey God, look at what they're doing to me. So let's see how God answers Samuel. Verses 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with what they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore, heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So what God tells Samuel is, hey, what are you getting offended for? They're not rejecting you. You're my prophet. You're my voice. You're my leader. You're my priest. You are the one that merely gives the words that I give you. I had a student this last week turned in a paper, and all he did was take a paper off of the internet, and probably bought it, I don't know where he got it. He changed his name and the date and the course title and turned it in. Well, my papers, I run them all through an automated plagiarism checker, and of course it came back 98% plagiarized, or words were stolen. And so I gave him no grade. I turned him into the university, and I get these lists, these messages back. I am offended. How can you possibly think this was all my work, and I would not ever do this, and I'm turning you into the university. And he's going on and just tearing at me. So I just messaged. I get this all the time. It's nothing unusual. So I emailed him, or I was messaging him back, and I says, well, I'm really not sure why you're angry at me. You wrote the paper. The plagiarism process, the program, caught you, and all I did was university policy. I turned you in and gave you no points. Why are you mad at me? I didn't do anything other than uphold what was supposed to be done. Yeah. And he's still, yapping away. So, until he called his academic advisor and complained, and that's where he made a mistake. And he's got 3 weeks left, and he gets his degree, and he very well may be tossed out and all of his grades wiped out.
Oh my.
Yeah. And you look at that and you say, what's the matter with these people? I look at them and I say, you've got to be smarter than that. You've gone this far through your program. You've got to be smarter than that. I don't care who you are. But we're going to find these people were exactly the same way. It's no different today than it was then. So God encouraged Samuel. And the Apostle Paul, when he writes, he says basically the same thing. If you are doing the work of Christ, then don't think it's strange or unusual when people come against you. You're going to suffer persecution for his name's sake. In other words, if you're doing it for him and you're doing his work, expect to be offended. Expect people to come against you. But they're not coming against you, they're coming against Christ. And that's the theme that Paul goes over and over in his epistles. So when we have people come against us when we're doing his work, we shouldn't be offended. And of course the secret there is to make sure we're doing his work. Okay. There are also those who, they think they're doing his work, but they're really not.
Yeah, it happens.
There are preachers, and I'm familiar with a lot of them. They think they're doing the work of God, but all they can get up and preach about is not watching TV or not doing something. Don't do this. You're going to go to hell if you do this or you do that. And that's not the gospel. Yeah. The gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And while we have to have standards, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, we need our standards and whatever, that should not be preached or presented in a way that offends people. If you do that and people get offended, then don't fall back and say, well, I'm just doing the work of God. No, you're not. You're doing the work of your own ideas and your own desires. Anyway, off the soapbox, and here we go. All right, let's go on. 1 Samuel. Now, we don't know here, by the way, what else God told Samuel. We have to assume that God told Samuel a lot more than this little bit here. Because we're going to find out what Samuel is now going to tell the people. All right, so verse 10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest. and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Now that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
And this wasn't some preacher that was, down in a little town someplace, decided to go out and evangelize, or, this was Samuel, the most important man in Israel, recognized as that. Samuel, who had a personal relationship with God. Personal, to the point where he could just talk to God.
Yeah.
Hey, Samuel. Yeah, oh God, yeah, here I am, what do you need? That was the kind of relationship Samuel had with God.
Yeah.
And the people knew it. I mean, here come the Philistines right after Samuel was made judge, and they're all up together in their conclave, and here come the Philistines, and next thing you know, there's a voice out of heaven, it roars like thunder, and the whole thing happened. This is the same Samuel. So wouldn't you think they would look at the words of God and say, oops, we better not do this? That wasn't the case. Now, this was not the description of an evil king. He was not describing worst case king. He was describing a king. And when you look at this, what does a king do? Well, he's going to conscript guys to come in to take care of his army and his chariots, and he's going to have guards, and he's got to have to support the government, so he's going to levy taxes. This is what Samuel was telling them was going to happen. And of course, as the court grows, he's going to have bakers and those that make perfumes, for the king and all of his concubines and wives, and that all has to. He's got to have somebody make the perfume, right? So they have to have people do that. And all the state dinners, and he has to eat, and all the servants around him. If you go to the Palace of Versailles in France and look at that place, they had 5,000 servants just to take care of King Louis. Think about that. So that's the magnitude of what we're talking about. And all God is saying is, if you're going to have a king, this is what's going to happen. The best of your fields are going to go to the king. He's going to send people out, and they're going to say, those are the best grapes, I want those grapes. Anything wrong with that? Because when people come to see the king from other countries, what do you want? You want to give him the worst of the crops or whatever he happens to grow? No, you're going to get the best. And that happens today. So that's all God was doing here. He wasn't telling them they're going to have an evil king. I've heard preachers say, this is what happened to Saul. He went off the tracks, and this is what happened, and he was a terrible king, and then we had, they go down 200 years later and talk about some other king. No, he was just giving a general description of what kings do. All right, he's going to tax them 10%. That didn't bother them at all, being taxed 10%. And yet mention tithes today, which is 10%.
Yeah.
People just go haywire over that. All right. Now he says, when this happens, don't cry to me. When all of a sudden you realize that those prime grapes that you've been tending all these years, all of a sudden, every year, all the grapes go to the king. Mm-hmm. Don't talk to me. I tell my kids that, I used to, not so much anymore, but Dad, what am I going to do? I said, well, I told you, and you did it anyway. Don't talk to me. There's nothing I can do about you. Figure it out for yourself. You were old enough to make that decision then, and you're certainly older now, so figure it out. I'm kind of a hard guy, but, you know, sometimes it's like hitting your head against a wall with kids. You get tired of hurting. All right, anyway, let's move. All right, so what was Israel's response to what Samuel had to say? Verses 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but we will have a king over us." I don't care what you say, we are going to have a king over us. That we, now this is key, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed their voice, and make them a king." And Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Every man go to his city." Now I think this really is telling what was going on here. Number one, they wanted a visible king. Now God, led them in the wilderness with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day, and they could see it, and it was there. But even that, when they came down to the Red Sea, and all of a sudden here come the chariots of Pharaoh, what was their response? I mean, here's the pillar of fire, here's the pillar of smoke. I mean, they're there separating them from the chariots of Pharaoh. And they begin to get after him. Well, why'd you lead us out here? Just so Pharaoh can come and kill us. And we should go back to Pharaoh. We should just surrender and go back. Because they didn't see a visible human king or leader that was going to battle for them. Now, if God had and this is my conjecture, if God had come down in the form of the angel of the Lord, you remember Gideon, the angel of the Lord came to him, that's a theophany of God. So if he would have come down there with, a big bandola on, and, two big guns, and all these shells, like Rambo kind of thing, and stood back behind him, they would have got behind him and said, "Yeah, blow them all up." Right? But they didn't see a man. They saw a pillar of fire. Never mind, the pillar of fire could have devoured all of them. That wasn't the point. They didn't see a man. And this has carried through all of this time. They saw the other kings, they go out to battle, and here's the king in the front, in his chariot, riding out in front with all of his finery, and, he's got the chariot driver, and he's got chariots beside him, and, it's exciting, big white horses, and here comes the king of Amorites, or the king of the Amalekites, or whoever was there. And they saw this, and they said, "Boy, if we only had a king, we could defeat everybody." Mm-hmm. Verse 20, notice the end of that. That may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.
Yeah.
They thought the king would fight their battles. So here comes 100,000 Amorites, and the king is going to ride out in his chariot, and he's going to defeat them all. No. He may be in the front chariot until the battle starts, and then he's going to retreat.
Yeah. He goes back.
Yeah. And who's going to do the battle?
Everybody
They
else.
are. And what really is silly is when you think about it, how many times did they come into battle? The last time the Philistines came up against Israel, what happened? God, God didn't walk out there in the battlefield with a sword and say, "Okay, come on." Samuel didn't walk out there with a sword. He was the leader. What happened? God spoke the words, and the enemy was defeated. The only one that could singularly fight their battles was Jehovah.
Yeah.
And that's the one they were rejecting in favor of a man who could not fight their battles. So what we see here is they wanted to have this look of, all the finery. And we see this under Solomon, where people looked at him and said, oh, look at all of this. That's what they wanted. That kind of prestige. It's called pride. They wanted to have everybody say, oh, look how prosperous this nation is. Not because of what they actually had or didn't have, but what they saw in their physical leader. That's what the problem was. Same thing has been all through the centuries. Basically, pride and inflated egos. God commanded Samuel to go ahead and give him a king, so Samuel sent them all home. Now, we just see that Samuel sent them home. Probably he told them, you all go home. It's going to take a while to select the king, and this is going to take some time. So you all go home, and when we are ready to appoint a king, we'll let you know. And so they all went home. This is really quite interesting the way all of this happened. All right, now we come to a rather interesting and somewhat humorous portion of Scripture, and it's the lost donkeys of Kish. We wonder sometimes. I said last week, God has a sense of humor.
Yeah.
He does. I mean, he could have used any one of a number of ways to get Saul hooked up with Samuel. But what does he do? He uses the lost donkeys of Kish. It's a great sermon or book even, but anyway. Oh well. The Donkeys and the King, I think would be a great book title. Anyway, let's start reading 1 Samuel. Now we're going to go chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechereth, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son, whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, please take one of the servants with you, and arise, go out, and look for the donkeys. So he passed through the mountains of Ephraim, and through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalim, and they were not there. Then he passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. When they had come to the land of Zuph, Paul said to his servants, who was with him, come, let us return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and become worried about us. Now on the back page I have a map, one of my maps. Sorry, my printer decided not to print red. I have plenty of red in the cartridge, it just decided not to print it. So I'm going to have to work on that. And yellow circles, blue circles on your map. The little one down toward the bottom, look at it myself here. Yeah. All right. You see the little one down there that says Gibah?
Yeah.
That's where he started.
Oh.
And he went straight up first, up there to the upper blue circle where it says Shechem and Tezrah. That's Mount Ebal, which was the mountain of Ephraim. So he went up that way first. Then he started down, that was Mount Ephraim. So then he headed down to the next little circle there, and that would be the Baal el Shalisha. From there, he went down to the land of Shalim, which is the next circle. And finally, he went over to the land of Benjamin. So you see, he had a lot of territory looking for those donkeys. Now, how they got out, donkeys are cantankerous critters, and when you do find them, they can never get them to do what you want them to do. But usually they stay in pretty good. Donkeys don't usually, unlike horses that want to kick fences down and are always prancing around, donkeys are more quiet. They'd rather stand in the field and watch the stupid horses running around than to get all more out of shape themselves. That's just a donkey, that's kind of the way they are. But look at the territory that two men covered looking for those donkeys. And they got all the way down into the land of Benjamin, the land of Zuph, without finding their donkeys. Now the land of Zuph is probably the land of where Solomon lived in, I'm trying to look for it if I can see, I can't even see it on my map, it's so bad here. Ramah, get to it. They were down in close to the town of Ramah. That, if you remember, was Samuel's. And so if you remember from last week, he would make the circuit. He would travel basically through that central region, judging and prophesying and taking care of civil matters and offering sacrifices and whatever needed to be done, because he was high priest, he was all of these things. So he would make that trip through that area. And it was in this area that they ended up and still didn't find the donkeys. Where were the donkeys? And maybe, just maybe, it was one of those woo 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 things, some craft hovered over them, sucked up all the donkeys, kept them for. We don't know, but we do know they couldn't find them.
That's a possibility.
And it seems like this would be a lot of territory to cover. We've been there, and donkeys are not apt to go climbing mountains. They're not goats. And so they knew where the donkeys would generally go. And so they were looking in the valleys, they were looking in the crevices and places where this herd of donkeys would go. And it was probably a very large herd. When it says that Kish was powerful, it meant he was wealthy. He didn't have an army and evidently didn't have a whole bunch of servants, or he'd have sent out 20 or 30 servants to go find these donkeys. Instead, he sends one servant, and I'm with it today. I shouldn't take motorcycle rides in the day I'm going to teach. That doesn't work well. And his son out to find these donkeys. All right, let's go to verse 6. It says 6-2, but it should be 11. Sorry about that. And he said to him, "Look now." Now, who said to him? His servant. So this is his servant speaking. He says, "Look now, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. So let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go." Then Saul said to his servant, "But look, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread in our vessels is all gone, and there is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have?" And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Look, I have here at hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I will give that to the man of God to tell us our way. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, 'Come, let us go to the seer, for he who is now called a prophet was formerly called a seer.' So Saul said to his servant, 'Well said, come, let us go.' So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up the city, they met some young women going out to draw water, and said to them, is the seer here? And they answered them and said, yes, there he is just ahead of you. Hurry now, for today he came to this city, because there is a sacrifice of the people today on the high place. As soon as you come into the city, you will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterwards, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore, go up, for about this time you will find him. So they went up to the city. As they were coming into the city, there was Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. All right, so what's going on here? The servant, it's interesting it was a servant and not Saul, recognized where they were and knew that Ramah was the city where Samuel resided. And he calls him a man of God, an honorable man, and somebody who, when he says something, it comes true. Now, there was an Eastern tradition. Time you came to in the presence of a superior man of rank, it was a sign of disrespect if you didn't offer a present to that person. And that seems a little strange, but think about it. Every time our president goes to another country, or somebody else's leader comes here, what do?
Give me a gift.
They exchange gifts. Sometimes they're valuable, sometimes they're not valuable. We've been to three of the presidential libraries down in California, and they have on display the different gifts, that were given to our presidents. They're on loan. They don't belong to the family. They're on loan from the government. In fact, almost everything in there is on loan from the government. But you see some everything from writing pens to figurines to something else. Most of the time they have some kind of a cultural meaning, and they're given as gifts. Well, that was kind of what went on in this day. But Saul says, I don't have a gift. I've got to have a gift to give to this prophet. And he makes an interesting statement. He says, our bag of food, or our, what does he call it? The bread of our vessels is all gone. What this refers to is when the shepherds or herdsmen or whoever went out to find their flock, because a lot of times they would just turn them loose, and they would up in the mountains where there was no danger, and they could just forage out there in the nice green pastures and stuff. The shepherds would go home. But when they got ready to go back to the sheep, or if they had lost their donkeys, they would take a bag and they would put enough flour and oil in the bag that they could make cakes to eat. And so they would just stop for the night, they'd make a cake and eat it, and that was their sustenance while they were looking for these animals. And they would take up to 30 days of supply of flour with them. And so here you see Saul and his servant, and they're probably on donkeys, by the way, because it doesn't say all the donkeys got out, so they probably had a couple of donkeys, so they were able to move fairly quickly on these donkeys, and they were carrying their bags of food. And they got on this journey, and we'll find out later, it was probably 4 actual days, because of the way they counted days, that they had been looking for these donkeys, and they didn't pack enough flour. And so here they were at Ramah, and they're out of flour. So they can't even make a cake to give to the prophet, a bread, flat bread. And the servant says, hey, I have a 1/4 shekel of silver. Now, a 1/4 shekel of silver was, if you remember from our studies in, where was it? The New Testament, and we also talked about it in the Minor Prophets. The shekel was the temple coin. That's the only place it was used in Israel. And the shekel was a silver coin that was used as money or as offerings in the temple. A half a shekel was a yearly contribution to the temple. It was a temple tax, half a shekel. So what the servant had was 6 months worth of temple tax. That's what he had. He said, I have this, let's give it to the prophet. Now, of course, they didn't have a temple at this time, I understand. But it was used in the same process or same idea. It was given as a tax to God's work. We call it a tithe type thing, a special offering. So Saul agrees. He says, yeah, that would be great. So let's go find this prophet. Now this verse 9 was obviously put in later at some point to explain the difference between a prophet and a seer. And it doesn't really shed a lot of light. But basically the difference was a seer means vision, visionary. So they would see visions. So if you went to them and said, where is my donkeys? You could expect them to see a vision of where the donkeys are and say, your donkeys are here. All right. A prophet, on the other hand, foretold the future. That was the difference between a seer and a prophet. But whoever inserted this, it says today, we call them seers, but they're really prophets. So the two terms had become mixed up by the time whoever was inserted this text in here on this verse. But for our purposes, we're talking about a prophet. And they called him a seer. They were not interested in knowing the future. They merely wanted to know, where's my donkeys? They had a short-sighted need for God. Where are my donkeys? That's all Saul was interested in. He wasn't interested in the future. He didn't know what was going to happen, just where are my donkeys? So they went into the city, started in, and they ran across these women at the well. And they point out Samuel. Hey, he's right up there, you see? Now, if they had taken off right then, they might have been able to catch up with Samuel. But the women go on to explain why Samuel is there. That wasn't the question. The question is, or was, do you know where the seer is? Yes, he's up there. Now, he just happens that he came to town today. It's like some people. They can't just answer a simple question. Mm-hmm. They have to go all the way around the bush to let you know everything that goes into that very simple question. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it was with these two. I have students write papers sometimes. I have one. It just asks for two things. What are the two things? And they start in. This author says there are 4 of these, and they go into this, and they put this whole thing up, and they could have said it in one sentence. The 2 are, that's all I want to know about. I don't need to know all the rest of it. Then they go in. Now the first one goes this way, and by the time you're done, they've written 300 words on an answer that could be dead with one sentence. That's the way some people are. And these are these women. But it was all, I think, in the providence of God that this would happen. Now he says, today he came to the city. Now this, some commentators, they say, well, this indicates he was not at Ramah, but at some other city because he came into the city today. Well, what if he was on one of his circuits and he came back to Ramah? What would you say? He came into the city today. So it doesn't mean that he wasn't at Ramah, as some commentators seem to think. But he came into the city for a specific reason. And that was because on that day there was to be a sacrifice of the people on the high place. The high place was probably, in fact it would have been an altar, a place where they regularly gave sacrifices and offerings. And of course Samuel, being the resident there, that would be the place where he would go to officiate over these sacrifices and offerings. So what was probably going on, well, notice what he says. You will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. Now why would he go up to the altar to eat? Well, you remember we were talking about the different types of offerings and sacrifices. One of them was called the peace offering. And this whole book of 1 Samuel deals a lot with the peace offering. And you remember the peace offering, they would take the animal and the right shoulder went to the priest that performed the sacrifice or blessed the sacrifice. And then another portion of that, the breast area, went to all the priests. It was divided up. It went into the pool, or a larder, if you will, and all the Levites and priests came and took their portion of that. The rest of it went back to the person who brought it. So what it was a big barbecue. So you would bring your sacrifice, they would section the sacrifice off, they would cook the meat, and then everything but the right shoulder and the breast went back to the person who brought it, and they had a feast. They had a big party. And this was what the peace offering was all about. Now at that party, it was not unusual to invite the priest who performed the offering, and sometimes other priests, I mean they would bring, whatever, to the family. One of the families would invite them to sit into their family feast. And this was a normal way they did things. And this is what was being planned here. Now at the altar, where they did this, they often would have a big hall. And the city leaders, the big shots, they would invite certain friends or dignitaries or whatever important people to partake with their family in the feast. And usually it was Samuel. Or Samuel could put on a feast and he could invite specific people to his feast. Okay? And so that's what's going on here. And so they said, well, you got to catch him before he gets up there to eat. But they said, you don't, and this is kind of a caveat, I think. I think they said, there's no set time, but they can't eat until Samuel gets there. Why couldn't they eat before he got there?
He had to pray.
He had to bless and accept the sacrifice, and it had to be waved before the Lord. There was a special number of steps that had to be performed before God would accept the peace offering. And Samuel had to be there to do it. So they're not going to have their party until after he gets there, blesses and officiates at the sacrifice. Then they would all go into the hall, and while they were going into the hall and get situated, the cook would be out there cooking the barbecue. And they would probably come in like we do today and have olives and dates or whatever, some hors d'oeuvres we'd call it today, and have a cup of wine. And you remember they had the couches, they all laid on their left side with their feet extended out, and they all sat there and chatted and ate with their right hand. So it was a time of fellowship and just talking. When the food was ready, the cook would bring it in and they'd all eat. All right. As they went up to the city, Samuel was just coming out toward them. Now, this would indicate that either these gals spent a lot of time talking and explaining everything, or Saul and his servant were very tired. Because if he was just in front of them, and they didn't see him until he was coming out, because he had come out of his house and headed toward the gate, which is what this indicates. He had to have gone home, probably put his rucksack or whatever he had with him away, maybe got his wife, because she was no doubt going to the feast with him, washed his hands or feet, and all that, and then came out to go to the feast. So it was some time before Saul and his servant got to that point. All right, now, let's start with chapter 9, verse 15. Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came, saying, tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over all my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines. for I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, there he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people. Then Saul drew near to Samuel in the gate and said, please tell me, where is the seer's house? Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today, and tomorrow I will let you go, and will tell you all that is in your heart. Underline that. This is an important statement that it's easy to miss. But as for your donkeys, they were lost 3 days ago. Do not be anxious about them, for they have been found. And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house? And Saul answered and said, am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me? Now Samuel took Saul and his servant and brought them into the hall, and had them sit in the place of honor among those who were invited. There were about 30 persons. And Samuel said to the cook, bring the portion which I gave you, of which I said to you, set it apart. So the cook took up the thigh with its upper part and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, here it is. What was kept back? I was set apart for you. It was set apart for you. Eat, for until this time it has been kept for you, since I said I invited the people. So Saul ate with Samuel that day. When they had come down from the high place into the city, Samuel spoke with Saul on the top of the house. They arose early, and it was about the dawning of the day that Samuel called to Saul on the top of the house, saying, get up, that I may send you on your way. And Saul arose, and both of them went outside, he and Samuel. And they were going down to the outskirts. As they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, tell the servant to go on ahead of us. And he went on. But you stand here a while, that I may announce to you the word of God. All right. We find some interesting things here. Number one, meeting with Saul was not a coincidence, nor was it a surprise. God told Samuel the day before that Saul was coming, and that he would meet Saul, and Saul was going to be the next king, or the first king, rather, of Israel. I can see, now if I were there and they had just told me I hadn't done a good job and they're going to replace me, and then God tells me, this is the guy that's going to take your place, what would your reaction be? Not on my dead body. I'll see what I can do about that. That would be the normal reaction. But that was not Samuel's reaction. He put his trust in God. He believed God. God said, this is what I want to happen. And so Samuel was perfectly satisfied in fulfilling what God wanted him to do. Now notice God even told him the hour in which he would meet Saul. About this hour tomorrow. It wasn't tomorrow, this week, next week. God was very precise. And God is always precise when he gives prophecies. Also notice what God said here. You shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines. Now wait a minute. We just learned last week that the Philistines had been defeated and they were never again the big power that they had been. So what's going on here? Well, what was happening was very similar to what happened at various times during the time of the Judges. The Philistines would raid. So we're going to learn later of the story of David and Goliath, when the armies of the Philistines came up. Well, they were headed by the army out of Gath, which had a guy called Goliath. So what would happen is these regional armies, or usually it was from a city or maybe two cities, they would go out and raid, and they would take crops or whatever, and then they would return. They weren't trying to defeat Israel, to take Israel over. They would just come and gather whatever they could. They were raiders, and then they would go back. Well, that was hurting Israel, and so they were crying out to the Lord. And what God is telling Samuel here is that Saul is going to be the one that puts a stop to that. And we find out later on that's exactly what Saul did. He led the army in and kind of took care of things. So that was the reason that God gives for going ahead and anointing Saul. However, that also brings up the kind of, I guess I would say, the flip side of the coin. What God was saying was, they want a king. I'm giving them a king. This is the king. This king's, he's going to go defeat the Philistines, but I'm going to stay out of it. They don't want me to defeat the Philistines. They don't want me to go in and take care of it. So I'm just going to let the king do it, and I'll stand back and watch.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of a double thing here. God was going to allow Saul to take care of the situation, but at the same time, he was going to back away. They want a king, let the king do it. They want somebody to fight their battles, all right, go for it. So when Samuel was going out the gate, probably the gate to the city, and Saul and his servant were coming in, they stopped Samuel and asked him who the seer was. Now, as soon as Samuel saw Saul, he realized, he knew who he was. And I really like what Samuel says here. He says, please tell me where is the seer's house? Samuel answered and said to him, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today and tomorrow. I will let you go and tell you all that is in your heart. Now, we can draw a conclusion from that, is that Samuel was just a very nice person, which he probably was. I mean, everything you read about him, he's probably a very, he never seemed to have a vicious bone in his body, Some of the prophets, like Elijah, nobody wanted to see Elijah come around. They all took cover. He was probably a rough, gruff, the kids made fun of him, so he just called the bears out to eat him up. I mean, that was Elijah. Hey, I'm the prophet. This is the way it is. But Samuel seemed to be more a very sweet kind of a person and just did the will of God. And so he, you might just think, well, he invited these two strangers to come up to the feast because you're supposed to take care of strangers, right? But there was another motive for Samuel. He says, I'm the seer. I want you to go to dinner with me. I'm inviting you, my special guest, to be at my dinner. And then you're going to spend the night, and tomorrow I will tell you everything that's in your heart. Our assumption would be, what's in his heart? The donkeys he's been chasing for 3 days. Yeah. He wants to know, where are my donkeys? But that wasn't what was in the heart of Saul. It wasn't that at all. How do we know that? Look at the next verse. As for your donkeys, if that's what was in Saul's heart, he'd have waited till tomorrow to tell him about his donkeys. He says, as for your donkeys, they ran away 3 days ago. But they've been caught, they've been found, and they've been returned. Into the problem. Where are the donkeys? They're home. Back in their pen, where they're supposed to be. So Saul could have said at that point, oh, let's go home. We got it. Let's just go home. But there was something in the heart of Saul that was different than looking for his donkeys. think we know what's in our heart. We think we know what we really want and what we're really concerned about. But when God looks at our heart, he says, that's not what you really want. Let me explain to you what you really want. And that's why the psalmist said, search my heart, O God, and see if there's any wicked ways in me, if there's anything in there I don't see. Search it. Tell me. Another place he said, clean my heart up and make it white as snow. Cleanse it with hyssop, which was a weed they used as a scrub brush. So cleanse my heart with hyssop, that it might be white as snow. We don't know what's in our hearts. Samuel knew about Saul. He said, we're going to discuss that in the morning. So they went on in. Came into the dinner, into the hall, and Samuel set Saul and his servant. I find it interesting, it wasn't just Saul. Normally the servant would have been someplace else, but he brought Saul and the servant, put them in a place of honor. That would have been close, right next to the host. Mm-hmm. Who was the host here? Samuel.
Yeah.
How do we know that? Because later he says in this section, he says he invited everybody. That made him the host. Mm-hmm. So the ones he invited, and we don't know who they were, my assumption is he invited all of the leaders of that region. Because he was making an announcement to them by his actions about Saul. By his actions, not by his words. So they set him down. Well, I'm sorry. Let's go back. I missed this. He told them about where his donkeys were. And then he says, and of whom is the desire of Israel? What's in the heart of Israel? What is their desire? What do they really want?
A king.
A king. Mm-hmm. They've been hollering for a king ever since they left Egypt. And he says, is it not on you and on all your father's house? Nobody in Israel considered Saul to be the next king. They weren't thinking about Saul as the king. They were thinking about a king. And Saul here, or Samuel, takes that desire for a king and says, isn't your house what they're desiring? Aren't you the one they're desiring? In other words, their desire is going to be fulfilled in you. Now that would be hard for us to understand, but notice what Saul responded. He understood exactly what Samuel was saying. He said, am I not a Benjamite? Now we know about the Benjamites. They were the left-handed guys, you know. And they came in and wiped the whole tribe out and then had to rebuild the tribe so that there would be the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that whole thing in Judges? They were the scum of Israel because of what they did. They were considered the lowest of the low, the tribe of Benjamin. And here Saul says, hey, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, the least of all the tribes. And my father's house is the least of all of the families in Benjamin. And we said, wait a minute, you know, his dad was rich and wealthy. Well, that's fine, but we don't see where he was a leader. He wasn't an elder. He wasn't on the council, you know, to run the events of Benjamin. His family was down the tree a ways from being a leader. And he says, and I'm the least in my father's house. How could I possibly ever be considered to be king? He understood the words of Samuel. What I find is interesting is he didn't jump up and down and say, oh, look, I'm going to be the king. You know? Isn't that what we do?
Yeah.
They came in and said, hey, you know, we're going to make you the president of the United States. We're going to put you in office. Look, I'm going to have all these state dinners. And I can eat whatever I want, and I'm going to have all these limousines to ride around in. Yeah. He didn't do that. Now Samuel took Saul and his servant, brought them into the hall, set them down, place of honor. Then he said to the cook, bring the portion which I gave you, of which I said to you, set it apart. This was probably the right shoulder that would have been his. Mm-hmm. And we're going to find it, reading on here, that he talked to the cook long before he invited the guests. So he told the cook, probably the day before, or at least he may have even been late getting into town because he stopped to talk to the cook. And he said, listen, I want you to take my portion, set it aside, because we're going to give it to a special person of honor. And I want you to take some of the side dishes, the best, and set them aside, because they're going to go to the man of honor. And I'm going to hurry along here, so let me get that. So anyway, when they got to the feast, they called for the cook. The cook brought in the portion that was set aside for Samuel, the special portion. And it was given to Saul. And Saul and his servant ate this special portion. And the cook said to him, here it is, what was kept back. It was set apart for you, eat. For until this time it has been kept for you, since I said I invited the people. So Saul ate with Samuel that day. Then they went back afterwards, and by the way, by seeing Saul eat that portion that was reserved for Samuel, it told everybody that Samuel considered Saul to be his superior. He didn't say anything, but through his actions, he was letting them know, this is the man that God has selected. So they went back to town. They stayed up on the roof late at night, and it was probably there, even though it's not recorded, that Samuel explained to Saul what it meant to be king, what he would have to do, how he would have to act, how he would set up the government, how he would you think about being king when there has never been a king. How would Saul have any idea what a king did? You have to say it was God who told Samuel, who related to Saul. This is how God wanted him to run the kingdom. All right. So the next morning they got up, took off, and as they were going to the outskirts of the city, Samuel told Saul to send his servant ahead, and he wanted something he wanted to tell Saul, something from the Word of God. All right, chapter 10, starting with verse 1. And they were outside the gate, just came to the gates of the city. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance? When you have departed from me today, you will find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah. And they will say to you, the donkeys which you went to look for have been found. And now your father has ceased caring about the donkeys and is worrying about you, saying, what shall I do about my son? Then you shall go on forward from there and come to the terebinth tree of Tabor. There 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. And they shall greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall receive from their hands. After that, you shall come to the hill of God, where the Philistine garrison is. And it will happen when you have come there to the city, that you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with a stringed instrument, a tambourine, a flute, and a harp before them, and they will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. And let it be when these signs come to you, that you do as the occasion demands, for God is with you. You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and surely I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifice of peace offerings 7 days, and you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So they get outside the gate, they send the servant on down the road, and Samuel suddenly pulls a little vial of oil out and pours it on the head of Saul. Sorry about that. Samuel poured it on Saul. Now, that was, of course, anointing him to be king, and that was one of the ways in which kings were anointed. There were 2 parts to the coronation of a king in Israel. The first part was the part that we see here, which was the anointing of oil by the prophet. And we see this again with David, same thing. The second part was actually what we would call the coronation, where they were accepted by the people, announced, this was the big gala thing that went on. And we see it today in England, when Queen Elizabeth passes on, one of her son or her grandson will take over as king, and they will have this big coronation that goes on and on and on, and all the glitter and glitz. And we've seen the crown jewels, and they are absolutely stunning, these crown jewels. They put all that regalia on. So that was started right here with Samuel and Saul. So while they anointed him king, he never announced him as king. He was just anointed, consecrated, or set aside to be king. That's important to understand. The anointing set him aside. And then the really interesting part is here that he kissed him. Well, why would that be? That was the normal way of greeting in those days. The prophets, the high priest, they didn't kiss people. They were considered to be the highest level. If you came and kissed them, they did not kiss you. Okay, that was just one of the little things, the cultural thing. And so Samuel, he said to Saul, "Well, I didn't kiss you, just because I wanted to. I kissed you because you are the anointed one. You are the one set aside to be my king." The prophet was under the king in terms of, and we see this all through the Old Testament. Some kings would imprison the prophets, and stuff. They were not considered to be over the kings. So when the kingship was established, the prophet moved from being the most important and highest level to being the second highest under the king. But Samuel was saying, I am relinquishing my position to you simply by a kiss. Now we could go into a lot of stuff here. All right, so Samuel gives him some prophecy. He said, first of all, you're going to go to Rachel's sepulcher, and there you're going to find 2 men, and they're going to let you know your donkeys have been found, and that your father is now worried about you. Then you're going to move on, and at the terebinth tree of Tabor. Does that sound familiar? Remember the terebinth tree where Deborah sat under it?
Yeah.
And the terebinth tree where the angel of the Lord sat? That's the same tree. Very important in the Old Testament. You're going to go to there, and you're going to meet 3 men. And one man's going to be carrying 3 kids, or young goats. Another one is going to have 3 loaves of bread, and the third one's going to have a skin of wine. And they're headed up to the high place, or the place of God. Probably they were going to make a peace offering. So what they had was the three kids, which they would take up, and the priest would cut off the right shoulder for himself, and he would cut the breasts out and give it to the priest, and the rest of it was theirs to have a feast. They had 3 loaves of bread, probably to use at that feast, or they would make it as a wave offering, and it would be given, some of it to the priest, the rest of it came to them, and they would use that during their feast, and they had a skin of wine. All the makings they needed for a feast. And probably they could get olives and figs because they were very plentiful. They grew alongside the road, so they could get the other things they needed for their little feast. And so what they did is they gave Saul 2 loaves of bread. Why would he give him 2 loaves of bread? Well, they didn't have any bread. They ran out, remember?
Yeah.
So they had the feast the night before, and probably had a little something before they left, but they're journeying, and they're probably hungry, and so God's going to supply for Saul what he needed, 2 loaves of bread, just what they needed. Of course, the loaves were the little flat cakes. All right? But above and beyond that, what did you do, and according to custom, when you met somebody who was your superior? You gave them a present. These men were giving Saul a present because he was their superior. Even though it hadn't been announced, as far as God was concerned, he was their king. So unbeknownst to them, probably, they were giving a gift to the king. And finally, they're going to get to this town, and where there was a Philistine garrison. Now this was probably a place where the raiding parties would come out of, or perhaps go to. We're not real sure what was going on there, but it was on the border. So it could have been, they could get to it from the Philistine side, and then this was overlooking where they were. But this hill was a place that was set aside. It was in Gibeah, and it was a place where they had a school of the prophets. And we find this from Josephus and some of the others. There was a school of the prophets that actually Samuel had established at this particular place. So when they came to the town, Samuel said, what's going to happen? You're going to come to town, and you're going to see this band of prophets coming down. They're going to have, they're going to have musical instruments, stringed instruments, tambourine. They're going to have a flute, and all of this is going to be going on. And these prophets are going to be coming down the street prophesying. Now in our lingo today, you can just see them coming, speaking in tongues and carrying on, and thus saith the Lord, That wasn't what the prophets did. I mean, they did some of that, I guess. But when the prophets prophesied, they weren't just telling the future or, doing things. The prophets did several things. They wrote psalms. They sang under the Spirit of the Lord. They also preached. And so they would preach to the people. They would guide the people with the words of God. It wasn't this futuristic thing, They would occasionally tell the future. They were prophets. But they went to the school of the prophets, and what they did at the school of the prophets, they learned to write music, they learned to sing, they learned to harmonize. They learned how to put messages together. We call it hermeneutics today, or homiletics, probably more the term we'd use. Homiletics, how you put your sermon, you have your introduction, and you build your sermon, and you have your conclusion, and like writing a paper. That's why it takes me so long. I never get out of the introduction. It takes forever. But anyway, and so when they're coming down, Samuel said, when these men come down, the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with the prophets. That's an interesting statement. Not only would he be able to preach, expound on the Word of God. Now remember, in those days, these guys were almost illiterate. The average son, daughter didn't go to school. Whatever they learned from their fathers. It was the prophets, and it was the priests, the Levites, that learned how to read and how to scribe, and they would take the Torah, and they would read it, and they would copy it, and all of it. It was primarily the religious people that could read well and could do all of it. How would Saul, without any schooling, know the Word of God? How would he be able to preach? And sing. How could Saul be able to harmonize and know the songs and be able even to play instruments? He didn't go to the school of the prophets. All right? So that's what he said was going to happen. But the most important thing is that Saul would be a different man from when he left. When the Spirit of God comes on you, when you have the Spirit of God, you are a different person.
Yeah.
Now, we also know that just because you can become a different person, you can also turn away from being a different person. And we see that in the life of Saul later on, where he turns from God and his whole being is again changed. So this is the first time that Saul gets changed, and it's by the power of God. All right, verses 9 to 13, basically. So it was when he had turned his back to go from Samuel that God gave him another heart. And all those signs came to pass that day. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. Then the Spirit of God came on him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets, that the people said one to another, "What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" Then a man from there answered and said, "But who is their father?" Therefore it became a proverb, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" And when he had finished prophesying, he went to the high place. All right, so as soon as Saul turned around from talking with Samuel, God gave him a new heart. What was in his original heart? Give us a king. Give us a king. That was what he desired with his whole heart, as did everybody in Israel. We want a king. How was his heart changed? We don't know. But I can make an assumption. Because he listened to Samuel, I think the heart of Saul became, how can I be the king you want me to be? Not just a king, the best king you want me to be.
Okay.
I firmly believe at this point that Saul had every intention of being God's king. Just from his chasing all over the hills, chasing donkeys. Learned perseverance, learns patience, comes back, listens to Samuel, doesn't get excited, doesn't, his heart. And then God changed that heart. When we have the Spirit of God come on us and God calls us, He changes our heart. We think we know what we want, but when God calls, when God says, "You're the one I want you to do something," your heart changes and that becomes what you want to do, what you desire to be the best at. If that doesn't happen, you better be checking to see if you're doing what God really wants you to do. A lot of people get excited about being missionaries. "Oh, I'd like to be a missionary." All right, so they start getting ready to be a missionary, and pretty soon you hear things like, "Man, that's a lot of work. I don't know if, I don't know about this and that." If that isn't your heart's desire, don't go be a missionary. You will not succeed. And that's just human nature. I tell people in school, well, what are you going to do with your education? Well, I think I probably might do that. What do you want to do? Well, until you figure out where your passion is, until you figure out what you want to do, I don't advise you to do anything. Sit on it. I was talking to Junie here the other day. She's a junior now. It doesn't seem possible she's that old. And I said, are you going to go to college? Yeah, maybe. I said, what do you want to do? I'm not sure. And her aunt was there, sitting there. And she says, well, she needs to go to college. And I said, no, I wouldn't even send her to college. And Junie looks at me, like, what? Until she decides what her passion is,
Right.
there's no use going to college. Because you're just going to get out or quit in the middle of it, or when you get out, you're going to hate doing what you took your major in. And then for the rest of your life, you're going to say, if only I'd have done this, I'd be more happy. Wait till you know what you want to do, and then go. You can go to college and get the basics, you know, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But don't go out there and say, I want to be a firefighter, and find out all the time you really wanted to be an accountant. And the two don't go together. All right, let's move on. Okay, so he began prophesying, he began singing, and notice the people noticed. It wasn't just because he was walking with the prophets. It wasn't just because he could make some noise, or he could holler, or he could do something. He was doing something he should not have been able to do. I firmly believed he picked up the instruments and he began to play the instruments. How could he play the instruments? How could he play a flute? He didn't know anything about a flute. He was playing the flute. He knew their songs. How did he know their songs? How could he harmonize? How could he sing with them? How could he preach? How could he do these things? People were standing back saying, isn't this the son of Kish? You know, he's a herdsman. He's been chasing donkeys all over the place. And look at him now.
Yeah.
And one man says, well, who is their father? Now we could look at that and say, well, it was Kish, you know. That isn't what he asked. The word used for father there, who is their teacher? Who taught him to do all of this overnight? How can he do this? Who taught him? What is there? You know, was he whooped up into some spaceship and he was, you know, came back and he could do all of this? You know, today that's what they'd be. Oh man, it must have been a spaceship to come up teach him. They were wondering who was their teacher. All right, so then he went up to the holy, up to the place, the high place, the place of worship. Verse 14. Then Saul's uncle said to him and his servant, where did you go? So he said, to look for the donkeys. When we saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, tell me, please, what Samuel said to you. So Saul said to his uncle, he told us plainly that the donkeys had been found. But about the matter of the kingdom, he did not tell him what Samuel had said. So he went up to the high place where the prophets had just come from. There's his uncle. His uncle knew what had happened on the way up there. And so he says to Saul, where have you been? Not, where have you been for the last 3 days? He said, where have you been that you can do all of this? Well, I had a spaceship come down and take me out. No. He you know, all of a sudden here he's hit with the question, where did you learn this? What happened that you could now do this? Well, uncle, you see, what happened, the Spirit came on me, and I have a new heart now. You know, that's what we want to be sure and tell everybody, wouldn't we? But notice what he said. Where have you been? I've been chasing donkeys. And that was a true statement. If Saul hadn't been chasing his donkeys, he'd have never found what God had for him. One of these days I'm going to preach a sermon on chasing your donkeys.
These people really love their donkeys.
Didn't know donkeys had anything to do with God, did you? And he said, I chased my donkeys and I couldn't find them. I never found my donkeys. So I went to Samuel, the prophet, to find out where my donkeys were. He did the right thing. He went and asked God where his donkeys were.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish I had more time. I got to move on. So his uncle then wanted to know what the prophet told him. And he told him the truth. He just didn't tell him everything. He said, the prophet told me the donkeys had been found, quit worrying about it. I love this interchange. It's really humorous to me. Looking at what happens and how Saul is sidestepping the issue and not telling anybody what had really happened on the kingdom side, masking it on what his outside activities were. All right. Now we go 17 to 27. Then Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah. Remember, Mizpah was where he called all of the leaders earlier. 20 years earlier, whenever. when he declared that he was the judge, by not declaring it, but just taking over. That's where he called all the leaders, and of course the Philistines were defeated by the power of God. So he called them all to Mizpah, and said to the children of Israel, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, and from the hand of all kingdoms, and from those who oppressed you. But you have today rejected your God, who himself saved you from all your adversities and your tribulations. And you have said to him, No, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans." And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. And when he caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Matri was chosen, and Saul the son of Kish was chosen. But when they saw him, he could not be found. Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord answered, "There he is, hidden among the equipment." The old King James says, "hidden." I love it. So they ran and brought him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than all the people from his shoulders upward. Anyway, and Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people?" So all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." Then Samuel explained to the people the behavior of royalty, and wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gib'ah. The valiant men went with him, whose hearts God had touched. But some rebels said, "How can this man save us?" So they despised him and brought him no presents. But he held his peace. All right, so here's what happened. Samuel called all the tribes together. First of all, he laid into them about how they were rejecting God, insisting on a king. He says, "All right, you king." So here we're going to get started with this. So all of you get your tribes. I want the tribal leader from each tribe to come before me. And what he did is cast lots. Now the way they cast lots in those days, we don't really have any examples of what they used. But something like rolling dice or flipping a coin. And the feeling was that they said, well, that was the way God would choose to select. In this case, I think since Samuel was also the high priest, he used the Urim and the Thummim. And again, we don't know how those worked. But whenever they asked God a question, it was revealed by the Urim and the Thummim. You go to war? Yes or no? That would tell them. And it was always right. And so they brought the tribes, and as each tribal leader passed by, he would check, yes or no. And it fell on Benjamin. So all the other tribes backed away. Then what he did is by tribe and clan. What they did is they would take the tribe, because there was how many families, and hundreds of, thousands in these. So they would take and they into thousands. And this was a clan, and that was probably already established. So the leader of each clan in the tribe of Benjamin would come before Samuel, and he would check. And from that, they took the clan, which would be 1,000 families. Then the leader of each family came before Samuel. And this is from history, of this event. And so then he checked each family. And the family of Mori was selected. Now, Mori was the father of Kish. So that's how that fits in. Yeah. So after they did, now they took all of the young eligible men out of the family of Mori. Don't know how many would be there. And as each one passed, they again cast the lot, and it fell on Saul. And so, oh, this is Saul. He's been the one. Well, evidently between the casting of the lot and when they decided to make the final, this is the one that was selected, do you all agree? He disappeared. Now, that tells us a little bit about Saul. Either he was terribly frightened, terribly embarrassed, or he didn't want to do it. Or he felt he wasn't qualified. I don't know which of those really fit the bill. I don't think it wasn't want to do it. I don't think that was the purpose. Probably from what he told Samuel, he probably said, you know, this is more work than what I'm really cut out to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing when you want to be a leader, and I see this a lot. You know, I can lead that. I want to be the leader. Okay, you're the leader. Now I need you to meet here. I need this paperwork. I need this filled out. I need you to keep track of this, and you've got to do that. And all of a sudden it's, I didn't sign up for that. I just want to be the leader. Well, what do you think a leader is?
Yeah.
The drum major doesn't get to be the drum major just because he fits the uniform.
Right.
You know, he's got to learn how to play too. He's got to learn how to keep it to beat. He's got to learn a lot of things as well as all the formations the band's going to go through. He's responsible for that. He has to meet with the, you know, the music director. He has to hold section meetings. He has to do all kinds of stuff to be the drum major. I know, I was a drum major, so I'm firsthand. A lot of people want to be the drum major, but then they find out what it's involved with. It's more than just walking down the street looking like a peacock. You know, there's more to it than that. So I think Saul was having some second thoughts. Not because he didn't want to, but I don't think he felt qualified. But notice how they found him. They didn't send out a search party. They weren't out looking for the donkey.
Mm-hmm.
They went and inquired of God. God said, oh, he's right over there hiding in the equipment. You can't hide from God. When God calls you, you can't hide.
That's right.
So they went and got him. Samuel stood him up before the people and said, look here. From his shoulders up, he's taller than anybody else. And I read this and I start laughing. He was a head taller than everybody else. The average height of that day, 5'6½". Now the average length of a head is about 12 inches. That means he was 6'5½". All right. But if you read this the way it's written, from here down he was the same height as a 5'6" guy, but his head was a foot longer. Even that wasn't the case. But you see if you that way, his head had to be 2 feet high to be able to fit the scripture. From the shoulders up, he was higher than anybody else. But anyway, he was 6'5". Everybody else was 5'6". So you can see Saul was a very big man.
Yeah.
Scott is 6'4". So
Yeah.
that kind of gives you a little feeling for how big Saul was. Not only that, he was handsome, he was fair, everybody loved him, and so they all shouted and said, long live the king.
Yeah.
And he became the king. Now, of course, there's always some. And there were the rebels. King James says they were men of Belial. Well, this guy can't lead us anywhere. It doesn't matter if God himself walked into a church and said, this is your new pastor. Well, he can't lead us anyway.
Okay.
Who gives him that authority? You're always going to have rebels.
That's right.
People who are never satisfied. It doesn't matter who does it. If God himself walked in, wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
It has to conform to their ideas. But notice this. Saul was just made king. What does that mean? That means he could have looked at these guys and said, hold it right there. Would you gentlemen come over here a minute and surround these guys? Take out your swords and let's just solve the problem right here.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's what I'd have done. You know, hey guys, let's take their heads off and then we don't have to worry about it. That's what Moses did in the wilderness, if you'll remember. When they said, oh, you know, you're not gonna lead you, and Moses prayed, and then he said, okay, anybody on my side, come over here. You all on my side over here, and everybody's on their side, okay, open it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the way he solved it.
Yeah.
But Saul had a different heart. He had a new heart. So
Yeah.
he just let it go. Any questions?